All right, so hello everybody. Welcome to the Punishment in Global Peripheries, Contemporary Changes and Historical Continuities workshop. I'm so pleased to see this happening. Máximo and I have worked on the organization of this workshop for months now, so I'm genuinely very happy to be here today. I'll first hand over to Professor Mary Borsworth, who's the director of the Center for Criminology, and so she will formally open this event. Then Máximo and I will say a few words just before the beginning of the first session. So Mary, over to you.
Thanks, Luis, and thank you everybody for coming. It's my great pleasure to really just give the sort of welcome to the virtual Oxford Centre for Criminology. We are very excited to be hosting this wonderful series of days of talks that Luis and Máximo have put together. And I think it's, I'm particularly interested, of course, as somebody who's worked for many years on topics of punishment. It's really exciting to see so many different approaches that we're going to learn from over the next few days, and to really, I guess, get the representation of different voices and different experiences from around the world, because I think the field of study is crying out for this. And so I'm very much looking forward to learning a lot. And thank you, Luis, for the immense amount of work you've done. This is really phenomenal, and you've pulled off something that's going to be great. So welcome, everybody.
All right, great. Thank you very much for these kind words, Mary. I'll now hand over to Professor Máximo Sozzo, who will say a few words on the ideas, the reasons, and the purposes of this conference, what we had in mind when we started planning this and so on. So Máximo, please.
Thank you very much, Luis. Welcome, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here, at least in this way, and to see this idea coming translated into reality. So we will try to discuss in these 3 days about punishment in global peripheries. Our general idea is try to reinforce the need to revise the take it for granted universalism of an important part of the perspectives constructed on punishment and society studies in the global north, based on a small group of countries or national contexts. We are trying to, in these 3 days of intensive discussions and presentations, try to provincialize concepts and arguments, considering their embeddedness in specific spatial and temporal coordinates. In relation to the exploration, the in-depth detail, dense exploration of context in the global peripheries. So we think it will be an interesting contribution, not only in terms of the discussion of the different studies that they will be presented throughout these 3 days, but also in trying to interrogate more generally and critically this general tradition of importation of concepts and arguments from some central context to peripheral ones. Of course, peripheries are a vast and complex terrain with boundaries that could be drawn in different and even competing ways. So there are different ways of being in the periphery in the social studies about legal punishment. So for example, one obvious thing is that we are now talking in English. And for many of us, this is not our first language or our preferred language. So it's not the same to be in the periphery when English, the preferred language to communicate scientific results in our present, is your first language, than when this is not the case. And it's not the same, of course, to have many resources to do research in richer institutions and context, and then when you have to in some way make your own way with the scarcity of resources in poorer institutions and contexts. And this is not something that happens not only across national contexts, but even inside national contexts. So this conference was designed to make room to these diverse ways of being the global periphery. So we will have papers from different places, very different places, and with very different situations, and in terms of this and other key elements in order to understand differences from Russia to Ireland, from India to Brazil. So one of the objectives of the conference is to talk between us, between the people who are working in these different contexts that could be labeled as the periphery, promoting a more intense exchange and learning from each other. Another objective is to discuss with scholars working on central context. That's why many of the discussants that we invite to be discussants of the different sessions, and they have kindly accepted to do that, came from the central context and have been working on legal punishment in their own context. And I think it's the ambition is to promote a dialogue that is more equal and more creative, more inventive with the intellectual production of the central context. That also at the same time, every time have in mind the risks of overgeneralization. That doesn't imply necessarily to renounce to the ambition of building generalizations, but critically interrogating how this task is frequently done. Of course, this event and the idea behind it it has also a political dimension that is connected. These processes of a critical importation of the intellectual production on punishment and societies studies in the global north to the global south, or in the center to the periphery, has been strongly connected with the dynamics of colonial and neo-colonial effects in the past and present. So in some way, it is also this event a way of trying to advance the project of decolonizing our field of knowledge. So of course, these are very, very ambitious goals, but we will try to do our best during these 3 days in order to make an effort in this direction. So thank you very much to all the presenters, discussants, chairs, and attendants for being here. And I hope that we will enjoy a great workshop during these 3 days. Luis?
Yeah, right, fantastic. Thanks very much, Máximo. You were very precise in your awards. I'd just like to say 2 other things before we get the first session started. So, and first, I'm not speaking for myself, but also for Máximo. So we would like to say a big thank you to everybody here. Thanks, Mary, for your kind words in the introduction, but also for the support since the very beginning of this initiative. And the same goes to Ian Loader, Caroline Hawley, and Rachel Condry. We would also like to thank all discussants and chairs for having kindly accepted our invitation. It is fantastic to have you all involved in this event. Of course, thanks to all speakers. I'm sure it will be really a challenge for some of you because of differences in time zones and so on. So Máximo and I have tried our best to accommodate everyone in a reasonable time, also considering the topics they are presenting. But yeah, of course, it was very difficult for us to consider everything and put it together. But yeah, thanks also to Angela Patterson, Carla Sepulveda, Jack Warburton, and Brian Egan for your massive support. We really appreciate it. And yeah, thanks to those who are now here with us. It's obviously really, really nice to have you joining us during this workshop. The other thing I'd like to say is that I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to hear from so many good scholars coming from so many different regions. The papers that will be presented on this conference comprise the reality of over 30 countries, in addition to some of the broader regions such as Latin America, Southeast Asia, Caribbean, and so on. And there are also papers that discuss more broadly some relations between the whole global north and the global south. So yeah, what a great opportunity. Another great point here is the possibility, of course, of working in collaboration with Máximo, whose capacity to work is simply unbelievable. To be honest, I don't know how he managed to find time and do so many great things. But yeah, in so doing, I think it also represents a nice collaboration between the Oxford Centre for Criminology and the Programa Delito y Sociedad of the Universidad Nacional del Litoral, which is to say between institutions from the global north and the global south. And I'm pretty sure these sorts of relations are certainly fundamental if one really want to southernize or decolonize criminology. So yeah, I think it's all from me now. I'll hand over to Máximo again so he can get our first session started. All right, over to you, Máximo.
Thank you very much, Luis. So our first session will start in a minute. So I will just say a couple of things that could be considered the house rules for the entire conference, but also for this session. Every presenter will have 20 minutes to give their presentations, and every discussant will have 10 minutes to do it. So we will have in every session around 20 and 30 minutes to discuss the different papers. We have sessions of 3 papers and sessions of 2 papers, but we try to assure that we will have enough time to produce in each occasion a very interesting discussion. So everybody could use the chat in order to make comments or to the different presenters or between the different attendants, but we will only take as questions for the discussion the ones that that could be asked through the tool of the Zoom program. In reactions, you have there a hand, the tool raise hand. So every chair could give the possibility to the different persons to make a question. I ask all of you to be brief and to keep comments in the shorter version possible in order to allow everybody to intervene in the discussion. So we will have after every session a brief break in order to relax, have a coffee, a mate, tea, or whatever, and that will take in each occasion around 20 minutes, and with a longer break for the lunch. Of course, for those who are in the UK time zone or around there. So we unfortunately have 2 papers that the authors could not present them because of several reasons. Laura Van Duffel in the last session of today, and Enrique Carvalho and Anastasia Chamberlain couldn't make it. So we will have today a bit more time to the discussions. So we can start with our first session. In this first session, we have 3 papers. The first one will be presented by José Brandariz from the University of A Coruña in Spain. Climate changes in the penal field between the global north and global south. Then a second paper will be presented by Gavin Slade from the University of Nazarbayev and Daniel Horn from the University of Strathclyde, Decarceration in the former Soviet Union, elite and popular punitiveness in the shadow of the Gulag. And then we will have a third paper presented by Laura Piacentini from the University of Strathclyde, Why Not Russia, Global Criminology, and the Question of Comparative Neglect. Our discussant today will be Professor René van Swaaningen from Erasmus University of Rotterdam. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Jose, you will have 20 minutes to do your presentation, so I give you the floor.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Good morning, especially to those who managed to be awake and participating here at 5:30 in the morning in the Americas. Many thanks, Luis, and many thanks, Máximo, for having accepted my paper proposal. I'm extremely happy to be here together with so many dearest colleagues and friends. Let me try to share my screen here. Yes, I guess that you can see my presentation. So my presentation today is based, recently accepted and released online by the European Journal of Criminology. Let's see whether this works. Yes. Okay. So a prominent penal change is apparently spreading across Europe and other global north regions since the late 2000s. Although many authors have downplayed the relevance of this shift, for others is so significant that it has been described as an Elysian movement, just as a obvious reference to the German sociologist Norbert Elias, and as an evidence of climate change in the penal field. Even leaving aside the prisoner release policies implemented in the framework of the coronavirus pandemic, there are apparently good reasons to agree with that description. Incarceration rates significantly dwindle in OECD nations such as Chile, Israel, Japan, and Mexico from 2008 to 2018. In continental terms, this prison decline has had a particular impact in Europe. Concerning European Union countries, incarceration rates fell by more than 50% from 2008 to 2019 in Bulgaria, Croatia, Cyprus, Estonia, Finland, Germany, Latvia, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Romania, Spain, and Sweden. And this prison population drop has been particularly salient in Eastern European jurisdictions, and more precisely in the former Soviet bloc. So in addition to Estonia and Latvia that have been already mentioned, Belarus, Georgia, Kazakhstan, Russia, and Ukraine, and I guess that Gavin, Daniel, and Laura are going to talk about this, have also experienced astonishing drops in their incarceration rates from 2008 to 2018. Interestingly, the US prison system has also been affected by this downward trend. The US incarceration rate peaked at 765 prisoners per 100,000 inhabitants in 2007, before continuously declining by 15% down to 650 in 2018. Although this trend has been far from homogeneous across US jurisdictions, in the framework of what Christopher Seeds has called a late mass incarceration scenario, from 2007 to 2019, prison rates diminished by more than 30% in 11 US states, and by the way, by more than 50% in Massachusetts. This prison decline starkly contrasts with the previous upward trend, in the framework of which incarceration rates rose globally over the last decades of the 20th century and into the first decade of this century. Currently, wide geographical areas are affected by this downtrend, corroborating that it is much more than a low-profile shift circumscribed to a handful of exceptional national cases. That being said, the prison downsizing is not a global phenomenon. Incarceration rates increased in a number of OECD and G20 nations, such as Australia, Indonesia, and Portugal, and skyrocketed in Turkey from 2008 to 2018. From a regional perspective, this upward trend is particularly noteworthy in Central and South America. Concerning meridional countries, incarceration rates significantly escalated in Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, and Peru, and more than doubled in Bolivia, Paraguay, Venezuela, and Ecuador from 2008 to 2018. So in the framework of this humble 15-minute presentation, I aim to provide some clues to make sense of this intriguing divergence between penal changes in Europe and the US and penal changes in South America. For these purposes, this paper largely relies on the academic literature on the recent prison downsizing, which suggests that a number of drivers and catalysts deserve particular attention. So the first point to be taken into consideration, the crime drop. Both the US literature and the European literature have highlighted the influence of the long-standing reduction of crime rates on the current decarceration phase. This phenomenon, generally known as the crime drop, affects many jurisdictions, albeit unevenly. In the US, the registered violent crime rate fell by 51.6%, and the registered property crime rate plummeted by 59% from 1991 to 2019. In the European case, the crime drop is particularly evident in the field of lethal violence, especially in Southern and Eastern Europe. The continent-wide homicide rate peaked above 8 homicides per 100,000 inhabitants from 1993 to 1995, and again in 2001-2002, then dropped to 2.8 in 2018. In addition, both violent crime rates and property crime rates also manifestly declined EU-wide from 2008 to 2018. Interestingly, sex crime rates are the significant exception to this general trend. In stark contrast, no crime drop can be verified in the South American case. The subcontinent's very high homicide rate in 2018 was similar to the homicide rates of the early 1990s. What is more, homicide rates have conspicuously risen in Brazil, Uruguay, and Venezuela over this 3-decade period. In addition, United Nations data suggests that both violent crime rates and property crime rates have either leveled off or slightly increased continent-wide, well, subcontinent-wide, in the last 15 years. Second point to be taken into consideration, public punitiveness. In the global north, a long-lasting and broad-encompassing phenomenon such as the crime drop may have actually been crucial in contributing to the prison downsizing. It may have significantly influenced the way in which state agencies, media outlets, key social actors, and the public in its entirety collectively construct the meaning of crime conflicts and contribute to shape hegemonic models of penalty. In fact, the enduring crime drop has undermined the until recently robust nexus associating escalating crime concerns with rising punitiveness and penal populist arrangements. Certain indicators apparently support this thesis. In the US, crime seems to have lost its former currency as a critical public concern. On average, only 2.1% of surveyed individuals single out crime and violence as the most important problem faced by the US in the monthly surveys conducted by Gallup in the last half of 2019. Likewise, in the EU, this indicator has followed a similar path. According to biannual Eurobarometer surveys, the percentage of surveyed EU residents who consider crime to be one of the two most important issues faced by EU countries declined from 23.1% from 2005 to 2009 to 10.1% from 2015 to 2019. In a stark contrast to this global north trend, Latino barometer data suggests that crime concerns have only begun to recede in South America in the last years, in the very few last years, superseded by more urgent concerns. In addition, these indicators show that crime concerns currently play a much more pivotal role in South American societies than in many global north countries. Third point I suggest to take into consideration, which may be called additional concerns. In exploring public punitiveness changes in the US, several authors have pointed out that crime concerns are being replaced by relatively new emergent concerns, such as those related to migration phenomena. In fact, migration control appears to be increasingly performing the same kind of social and political roles usually associated with standard penalty. To put it bluntly, in the US and the EU, moral orders currently seem to be less based on crime and punishment than on renovated racial and xenophobic stratifications. Empirical data confirm this thesis, in my opinion. In line with Trump's high-profile anti-immigration agenda, according to Gallup estimations, the number of US residents considering immigration as the most important problem faced by the country began escalating in 2015 and reached its highest percentage ever in July 2019, concomitantly with the widest support verified so far for anti-immigration measures. Concerning European countries, Eurobarometer surveys show that, as can be expected, collective anxieties over immigration peaked in the EU in the second half of 2015 and dwindled ever since. However, the number of surveyed individuals selecting immigration as one of the two most important problems faced by EU countries rose from 14.7% from 2005 to 2009 to 24.4% from 2015 to 2019, ranking well above crime concerns in the latter period. In short, it does seem that immigration is increasingly playing the proxy role of condensation symbol representing other social anxieties in many global north jurisdictions. Once again, the South American scenario is markedly different. The percentage of non-citizen residents is still very low in the subcontinent, 3.6% in 2020, and with the exception of countries particularly affected by the Venezuelan exodus, such as Chile, Colombia, and Peru, it has not significantly mounted in the recent past. What is more, concern over immigration are largely playing a very minor role in the field of public fears, falling very short of overshadowing crime concerns. Chile is the only remarkable exception here. And the last point I want to suggest to take into consideration may be called the slow crisis of the war on drugs. Okay, so the vital part played by the war on drugs in fueling the punitive turn and mass incarceration in the last decades of the 20th century and into the first decade of this century cannot be overstated. Conversely, various authors have highlighted the significance of the climate change in the field of drugs in enabling the prison population decline. Indeed, a number of countries and various US states have begun to adopt a promising decriminalization and harm reduction agenda in reforming drug policies. This new policy landscape has had an impact on the penal field. The criminalization of drug markets is leaving behind its former role as main engine of the amplification of penal power. And about to conclude, Máximo. In the US, the percentage of state and federal prisoners combined sentenced for drug crimes dwindled from 24.3% in 2000 to 17.9% in 2018. That's not very remarkable. But nonetheless, the percentage of prisoners sentenced for drug offenses manifestly diminished in 13 European Union and European Free Trade Agreement jurisdictions from the late 2000s to the late 2010s, especially in Croatia, Greece, Ireland, Portugal, Spain, and Switzerland. In contrast to what has happened in these global north jurisdictions, the penal climate in relation to drugs is far from cooling off in South American countries. Although no continent-wide data on the number of prisoners for drug crimes are available, the indicators on drug seizures are particularly revealing. Seizures of both cocaine and its precursors and marijuana have been almost constantly on the rise in all South American jurisdictions over the last 2 decades. In addition, Latino barometer indexes show that drug crime concerns are not on the decline in the subcontinent. So just the last two sentences, just to conclude, it goes without saying that much more comparative research is needed to ascertain why South American nations have not followed the path of penal moderation that is gradually consolidating in many global north regions. However, the four aspects taken into consideration in this paper provide promising clues to further explore why no change of penal climate seems to be on site in the South American, global South. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jose. Perfectly on time. So now we have our second paper by Gavin and Daniel. Gavin.
Thank you. Okay, I'll share my screen. I hope everybody can see that. Okay, so I'm just going to have the PowerPoint like this. I'm not going to go full screen so I can sort of see people's faces. I don't feel like I'm just speaking into a computer screen. Okay, so firstly, thank you very much to the organisers. I hope everybody can see my PowerPoint. Really appreciate the invitation. This is quite exciting, I think, for myself and Laura, who's coming next, and Daniel Horn, because we are all working on this one project called the Gulag Shadow. In the Gulag Shadow, it's an ESRC funded project. And this is pretty much the first time we're presenting anything from this project. We've been working away for 3 years, collecting lots and lots of data. So it's quite exciting to present this. It's also great to see Branda's presentation because this hopefully will really play nicely off the back of that, since we'll be giving an in-depth case study of one of these cases that, as Branda calls it, of prison downsizing. The title of the paper is Decarceration in the Former Soviet Union. We've been collecting data on elite and popular punitiveness, and this is what I'll be talking about in this presentation, in the talk. So the outline for the presentation, the rough question we are aiming at, that we're trying to answer, is we're just going to take one case study here for the purposes of the presentation, which is the case of Kazakhstan. We're asking the question, how and why did Kazakhstan pursue decarceration as a policy goal from the 1990s onwards? I'm dividing the presentation into 4 sections to hopefully make it easy to follow. So the first is background on punitive terms versus studies of decarceration as a sort of underdeveloped area, which actually plays off what Branda's already mentioned. I can almost miss out that part since Branda's sort of covered it. The second section is decarceration in the former Soviet Union. So looking at that process that Branda has already highlighted about the former Soviet Union, and specifically looking at Kazakhstan as a case study. The third part, which is really the meat of the presentation, is to give an analysis of that Kazakh case study and to try to show the importance of insulation from public opinion in the Kazakh case, and the way in which the prison service, in fact, was actually one of the initiators of prison downsizing, decarceration. And that will be based upon data that we've collected from elite interviews and opinion surveys. And then finally, in conclusion, I'd like to suggest why the former Soviet Union might be a rich field of study for us when we're doing this type of work on global trends in punitiveness. Okay, so the first section, the punitive term and decarceration, can go through this quite quickly. So I think, as Branda already mentioned, we have a lot of studies of the punitive term when we think about the role of public opinion, politicization of law and order as an issue, and the role of media in this. So the punitive term meaning the increased use of prison, control logics in the management of prisons, expressive forms of punishment. So we go back to 2007, we see Jacobs talking about decarceration as a topic, as basically virgin territory, a sort of relative lack of studies in this area. Now, as Branda has mentioned, obviously over the 13, 14 years since that was said, there's been growing interest in processes of prison downsizing, as we see this in the countries of the global north. Though that is still, to some degree, we could say, less well studied than in the case of punitive terms and increase in prison populations. So in looking through the relatively sparse literature on prison downsizing, on decarceration, how exactly that occurs. There seems to be two particularly important theoretical mechanisms here that might explain decarceration. So often in the literature we find that explanations of how prison downsizing occurs is really just to take the inverse of how a punitive turn occurs. So it's basically to talk about insulation from the type of penal climate that Branda was just talking about. So the insulation of penal policymaking from politicization, and the problem of vested interests in the status quo when you already have high prison populations or increasing prison populations, which requires the overcoming of certain vested interests, particularly in terms of prison services and the private sector. So those two particular mechanisms about insulation of penal policymaking and the issue of invested interests and reimagining of prison services are the two sort of theoretical threads that I'll try to spin through the story that I'm going to tell about Kazakhstan. So how does this apply in the former Soviet Union? How do these theoretical factors play out? So coming to the second section, decarceration in the former Soviet Union, I'll present some statistics on this just to show the general trends. So here we have quite complicated graphs. So these are the 15 former Soviet republics with a sort of line of best fit drawn across them in terms of the rate of the prison rate over the period of time from the 1970s onwards. So we can see an overall decrease. Now, there are a couple of things I think just to highlight when it comes to this graph. So one thing is to highlight that the prison population was declining in the late 80s under Gorbachev, Perestroika, Glasnost, and then the prison populations in the former Soviet Union tick upwards in the 1990s and increase during a period of democratization and the move to market economies. And they sort of hit a peak in the year 2000. And from that point, they start to decline, generally speaking, with a couple of exceptions. Now, in the year 2000, Nils Christie in Crime Controllers Industry was talking about the former Soviet Union as potentially increasing its prison population growth because of the impact and exposure to the risk factors that are in the punitive turn literature in terms of exposure to the world economy and sort of marginalized populations, declining state budgets and so on and so forth. Instead, that prediction did not play out, and we see from the year 2000 this decline. In the graph on the right, we have highlighted Kazakhstan. So Kazakhstan, we want to say here, is something of a poster person for this type of trend where we see this decline. Again, I want to just highlight that we see sort of two waves of decarceration in Kazakhstan. One is in the year 2000, we see a sudden drop off, and then the other is in the year 2010. So we sort of see two sort of little peaks and then drops in Kazakhstan. So there are two waves, and those waves are referred to by elite policymakers in Kazakhstan as two waves of decarceration. Just to highlight that further, here are percentage decreases in prison populations and prison rates across the former Soviet Union. As we can see, with the exception of Turkmenistan, where we can't really trust the data, and Georgia, which is an exceptional case, we see declines from the year 2000, and Kazakhstan has the highest decline of all prison rates across all of those 15 former Soviet republics, minus 64% in terms of the reduction in the prison rate from the year 2000 to 2018. Only Ukraine has higher, but we can't really count Ukraine because of the problems with the war in Ukraine, the secessionist regions, and the annexation of Crimea, which has possibly impacted that rate. So Kazakhstan is a very nice critical case study for studying this process of prison downsizing in the former Soviet Union. This slide just gives you some pictures from Kazakhstan, which shows the actual physical results of the decarceration in Kazakhstan, where we've seen a large number of prison colonies, as they're known in the country, closed throughout the country. And these colonies were built in the 30s and the 40s during the time of the Gulag, and also in the 1960s during the Khrushchev period. So we see this actual physical sort of symbol of that decline in the prison population. So how did this happen? The mechanisms of decarceration in Kazakhstan, what exactly was occurring? Well, the first wave, if we take that first wave around the year 2000, that went on from 1998 to 2010, we see the recategorization of offences, a move towards the expansion of administrative offences and misdemeanours, which do not carry prison terms. And a critical element of this decline is a sort of front-end mechanism. So this isn't about the release of prisoners so much as the diversion of offenders away from courts and from the prison service. So we see what our colleague Alexei Trochev, who studies this process, calls a dramatic expansion of the use of reconciliation from 1997 onwards, when it's introduced into the criminal procedural code in Kazakhstan. Now, reconciliation was not in any Soviet criminal procedural code, so this is entirely new, and we see a massive expansion in the use of reconciliation, which diverts offenders away from the prison system, which I can speak about a little bit more maybe in the Q&A. There are a number of other factors here, including a reduction in pre-trial detention requests by the prosecutor's office, but a number of different elements here. Now, the overall drive is to reduce the use of amnesties, which was the traditional sort of Soviet way of reducing prison populations, which was rather ineffective. So this is an attempt to really internalize and really push this policy of prison downsizing as something which is consistent over time in Kazakhstan. So the interesting thing about these particular changes is that they're driven in large part by the Ministry of Interior, the Home Office, the Kazakh Home Office, and the prison service itself as part of the Ministry of Interior, as part of a sort of general move towards humanization of criminal justice. So following on from the first wave, the second wave, which is a much more broadly advertised policy statements. We have a statement, we have policy documents entitled 10 Steps to Reduce the Prison Population. That really comes on the back of the first wave. The first wave, for me, is the sort of critical thing, the curious case, the sort of puzzle that needs to be explained. So how is it that this former Soviet country adopted these changes? Why did this first wave occur leading to the second wave? So that seems to me to be the first order question that needs explaining, is to try to understand how a sort of mobilization of opinion occurred that produced sort of this narrative that decarceration was required in Kazakhstan, and actually mobilized the relevant actors to make the changes to the criminal code and the criminal justice practices that would actually drive and produce that decrease in incarceration. So here particularly we're talking about trying to convince the presidential administration. So Kazakhstan is an authoritarian country. It's a super presidential system. If you convince the presidential administration, you are in a good position to be able to implement whatever reforms it is that you want. Now, there are certain narratives of decarceration that I'll pick up on in what's remaining of the presentation. So these are the economic burden of mass incarceration in Kazakhstan, the conditions of the prisons, a desire to break with the Soviet past and become a normal country, which is a discourse that emerged in Gorbachev's time back in the 1980s, and Kazakhstan's international standing and how it ranks in terms of the World Prison Brief, for example. Now, the key thing that I want to highlight in the final part of the presentation, which is really the analysis, is that these narratives were developed for elite consumption. This was not about trying to convince public opinion. This is an authoritarian country, so simply public opinion doesn't figure here as much as it might do in other contexts. And the other thing that I think is very important to draw attention to in terms of this narrative being built is that it was mainly the prison service in the first place that actually mobilized these narratives. Now, again, this provides some sort of contradictions or I think interesting points when we compare to what we expect to see based on the literature that we read, especially from the West. So moving to that final section, I've titled it Insulation from Public Opinion, and looking at the prison service as an initiator and facilitator of the prison downsizing decarceration process in Kazakhstan. So the first thing to say, this graph is very sort of complicated. I'll sort of quickly go over the slide. One thing we were interested in is to what degree is the Kazakh public actually punitive? So we constructed a a certain index with 10 items that looked at punitiveness, and we ran nationally representative surveys in Kazakhstan and Russia asking questions about punitiveness. Now, the overall results of that show that the Kazakhstani public opinion is more punitive at a statistically significant level than Russian public opinion. There is a lack of support for lenient sentencing. So public opinion here doesn't seem to be necessarily driving elite policy. Now, of course, it's possible, we did these surveys in 2019, it's possible that the decarceration processes have already been going on 20 years and they're informing the public opinion. I think that that's unlikely based on the elite interviews we have, where it seems that the general perception was that the public was punitive. We could frame this in terms of international comparisons. That's with using the international crime victimization surveys. I'll leave that for now. Maybe we could come to that in the Q&A. I've got my colleague Daniel Horn, who is working with these surveys. So in terms of public opinion, when we take the actual expert interviews that were done with people who were engaged in the reform processes, particularly in the first wave of decarceration, we see that the narrative is very much that the public was simply not asked about their opinion about what they thought in terms of reducing the prison population. It was mainly the prison service that was the initiator. And that's because once you get the Procuracy, Ministry of Interior, the Presidential Administration and MPs in place, they have the general picture, then the public simply, well, they just understand that the state budget is the winner. So here we have a reference to the economic burden and how we could, if we make a nod to public opinion, we frame it in terms of economic savings. Also, an element of the narratives coming out of the prison service about why they advocated for this type of prison downsizing was about the conditions. So just that there were simply too many prisoners, overcrowding everywhere, cases of malnutrition, and sort of extreme cases of having to survive during the 1990s. So moving to the narrative of this idea of a break with the past and Kazakhstan becoming a normal country, we also see references to public opinion here. So we have this also from one of our elite respondents that said, we are the successors of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was a punitive system, avenge, punish, severity, no quarter. It rubbed off on us all, and many people believed in punitiveness. So that first wave, it was the most difficult to persuade the people of humanization. We approached it carefully. We tried not to touch the gravest crimes in terms of reducing punishments for the gravest crimes. So we could explain to civilians, so that it's the offender's first time, let's not punish too harshly. Now, I've highlighted the word civilians there, and I'll come back to that. The idea here is that our respondents within the prison service consider themselves as military, and I'll come back to why that's important right towards the end. Okay, so this was important, this idea of trying to convince people who have been sort of conditioned during the Soviet period to be punitive, and how to actually do that. Now, this is related to Kazakhstan's international standing, and here I use a concept developed by John Heathershaw in 2013, talking specifically about Central Asian states in terms of them being global performance states. That is, states that are inherently exhibiting forms of weakness, plug in to certain networks of expertise, international rankings to try to simulate efficacy, to try to simulate state action and effectiveness. And here we're talking specifically about the World Prison Brief. So this being very, very upfront and foremost in the minds of policymakers in Kazakhstan in the 1990s, in the 2000s, about the position of the country in these statistics and how that looked in terms of trying to make the country a normal country. So here we have international influence, particularly not from Russia, I think that's important, but traveling instead to places like Poland and Sweden, and penal reform international also influencing them. So here we have, for example, a quote from the former deputy head of the prison service in the year 2000 when he was serving, that everybody wanted to decrease the prison population, partly because of the image of the country. We were third in the world per 100,000. First was America, second Russia, third Kazakhstan. This was somehow unacceptable. Now, for me, the curious thing here, or perhaps one of the contradictions, is to try to understand, well, why is this impulse coming from the prison service? Why would it be the prison service? This doesn't figure or doesn't feature in terms of our theory about how prison downsizing might occur or decarceration might occur. Usually we think of prison services as being status quo actors, as resisting these types of reforms. Now, it seems to me that the prison service, the reason why they were able to be a mobilizing actor here in terms of promoting decarceration was because of the fact that they were part of the Ministry of Interior still, and they still are today. So here actually Kazakhstan had not reformed in the way the international community might have expected them to or wanted them to. So against international best practice, they were not moved to the Ministry of Justice. Well, they were moved, but only briefly, and then moved back to the Ministry of Interior. So as part of the Ministry of Interior, the prison service were able to maintain influence on important institutions like the presidential administration, because the Ministry of Interior is such a hugely important ministry in all the former Soviet countries. Ministry of Interior officials are militarized. They have military rank, they're not allowed to be unionized, they're not allowed to join political parties. Their prison service professional culture is subsumed by a militarized professional identity. So we see this actually when I ask questions with the expert respondents about why there was no resistance amongst prison officers to this type of decarceration, which might threaten their jobs. They simply said, well, they could move to different offices, different departments inside the Ministry of Interior. There was no resistance because these prison officers guard things, not just prisons, but all sorts of things. They can guard other things other than prisons. So here we have a sort of curious element to this. So I'm going to finish up. I think I've been told. So I'm going to finish right here. That's 20 minutes. So the conclusion, why should anyone care about the former Soviet Union? Why should anyone care about the case study of Kazakhstan? What's interesting about it theoretically for the broader debates that we're having in this conference? Firstly, I think the former Soviet Union, it speaks to two literatures. So the first one is global and Southern criminology literatures. How does the former Soviet Union fit in here? We're talking about peripheries. I hear that word in the program and in the comments at the start. But in some ways, I feel that the former Soviet Union perhaps is better thought of as a semi-periphery, which can use sort of prison rates as a signal of respect for human rights and its willingness to join the global community, but at the same time can actually resist certain global trends, is not necessarily completely dependent on foreign direct investment. So I think that this is one area that we can learn something from the former Soviet Union. I think it's very interesting that, you know, just to hear Branda talking about the former Soviet Union, it's so rare for me to hear presentations that bring in the former Soviet Union into the global debate, but yet we've seen these decarceration processes occurring for the last 20 years. You know, there is something there that the region can tell us and has been overlooked to some degree, I think, so far. And the other thing is, if we think of just about how we theorize and conceptualize punitive and leniency terms, what we have in the former Soviet Union is a form of natural experiment. All of these countries coming out of the Soviet period with the same institutions, the same criminal justice institutions, and then breaking and splitting and moving in different directions. And we can study those processes in detail. I've only given one case study today, but we can put Kazakhstan in comparative context. So we have multiple cases of specific decarceration processes, each one varying by speed and depth. And we'll take into account certain elements here. The type of regime, the degree of policy insulation, that varies right across the region. What type of regime are we talking about? Is it a managed democracy? Is it democratizing? Is this a hybrid regime? Is it authoritarian? What about the mobilizing actors? So I've highlighted in the Kazakhstan case, and there's an unintuitive role here of the prison service and prosecutors, which we wouldn't expect. And then finally, the exact mechanisms by which decarceration occurs. In Kazakhstan, I've highlighted the idea of reconciliation, but in Russia, that is hardly used. In Belarus, that is hardly used. Each one of these countries that have also been decarcerating have used different types of mechanisms, and we need to ask why that would be. So there's a lot of potential here, I think, for how we can study this type of process. Okay, thank you. I think I've run over a couple of minutes. I'm sorry.
Thank you very much, Gavin. Thank you very much. So now I give the floor to Laura. Laura, please.
Hi there. Thank you very much for an invitation, Luis and Maximo, and I'm really delighted to be here, as is Gavin and Dan. And for us, this is a real opportunity for us to launch our Gulag shadow study to a criminology audience. My paper is going to take a slightly different approach to Gavin's, in that I'm going to just sort of do a broad overview of some of the concerns I've got about global criminology's preoccupation with certain jurisdictions and what I call the comparative neglect or the curse of comparativism when it comes to comparing different jurisdictions across the world. I'm just going to share my screen with you. Okay. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Laura Piacentini, and I'm a professor of criminology at the University of Strathclyde. And for about 27 years now, I've been researching post-penal punishment cultures in the former Soviet Union, but mainly Russia. That is my primary area of expertise. And I publish with Gavin and others on this subject. And this is a big study that Gavin and I run together called In the Gulag's Shadow, Producing, Consuming and Perceiving Prisons in the Former USSR. And in this project, we are seeking to essentially ask a normative question using empirical methods, which is to produce a broad analysis of the culture of punishment in the former Soviet Union, comparing Kazakhstan with Russia, comparing three key strands, which are attitudes to prisons and punishments, rates of incarceration and trends, and also a large branch of qualitative work, which is looking at how the prison is consumed and produced in popular culture, and how penal spectatorship is performed in various forms. We've been doing this work during COVID-19. As you can imagine, it's been extremely difficult. So I just would like to say personally thank you to Gavin and Dan for their presentation. And Gavin's been keeping the wheels on the project really overseas. So thank you for that. I've got Vladimir Putin here as Mr. Exceptional on the screen because I'm wanting to sort of say something about what I think is one of the problems with criminology and its subject and its treatment of prisons in the former Soviet Union. Now, might I begin with a piece of art, if I may? Let me just get this down. Okay. Some of you may be familiar with this painting. This is Joseph Albert's homage to the square. May I ask you all to look deeply at the painting if you can. Now, the composition of this painting is straight enough, isn't it? It's four similar squares within each other, each in a different colour, and all significantly aligned to the bottom composition rather than the top. If you stand back from homage to the square and look at the whole thing, I'd like you to consider what is the relationship between the four squares. Are they stacked on top of each other? Are they cut out like pieces of paper? Are they sinking underneath each other? Are you looking at the tunnel? Do some appear to push towards you and others fall away? And how does it change with each version of the square you're looking at? Now, looking at the pieces in this image, you might find that you're able to sort of force your eyes to look at the stack as a block of a tunnel, or you may find that you're instinctively drawn to one interpretation of how the squares are arranged. Now, this is exactly the principle that Albert's experimented with when he produced hundreds of versions of this square in tapestries, paintings and drawings and so on. He each explored a basic question. Can an artist create the appearance of three dimensions using only colour relations? Similarly, for me as a punishment and society scholar, how can I create dimensions of understanding of form and shape of penal systems in the global carceral space using only one question that has prompted me to think about global punishment through looking at Albert's work? And that is the question of what makes a penal culture exceptional. My starting point and Gavin's with our project has always been about the sociology of imprisonment. That is, what is the role of the prison in state-society relations and how does this disperse through our national and global understandings of carceral forms and, crucially, how we approach the study of global carcerality. So I really hope this event will speak globally and comparatively to those questions about the role of the prison in the construction of state power. And so I want to understand better, and have been trying for this nearly 3 decades now, to better understand, for example, how the trope of dangerousness is automatically reinforced and framed within a circulation process and within a form of capital accumulation. And I've been interested in this in all my professional career for several reasons. As Gavin and José have outlined, prison population growth is changing and it's created significant global burdens regardless of the fluctuations on national governments and public policy. I kind of look back to Gresham Sykes' slim volume of the Society of Captives, and I think he would simply be horrified if he looked at the state of massive incarceration in the world today. And it's interesting when you look at the foreword to his recent edition of Society of Captives, Bruce Western says that Gresham Sykes would have called the prison then an exotic institution. So when we hear Sykes talk about the prison is out of politics, we may find ourselves harping back to a bygone era, a penal imaginary, where punishment is at least in scale restrained. So Sykes, for me, in all the work I've done and the work we're doing just now in the Gulag Shadow, is trying to challenge us to reimagine the idea of imprisonment, the idea to confine, to hide, to control, which remains resilient in most world political economies today. I'm also really interested in this question of the sociology of imprisonment and global carcerality because, and Mary referenced this in her introduction, prison sociology has until recently followed a very westernized way of seeing the penal world. It is one consumed with prison rates and fixated at the same time on the governance of the prisoner body, to paraphrase Bourdieu, to make meaning out of the penal experience from the perspective of the subject, the prisoner. So the prison sociology world, or the punishment and society world, has been very much engaged and preoccupied with description, over-analysis, shock and awe, over, until recently, theoretical reflection. On top of this, it's important to say this, that prison sociology is incredibly classed and gendered. It is a branch of criminology that produces a symbolic power over who studies the prison and why. We see in citation that it's men who are mostly cited, and where they are based until recently has been mostly elite universities. And so the subject, and this is relevant to this conference, is reproduced these westernized representations through the underrepresentation of people from Black, Asian, minority ethnic backgrounds, women scholars and ECRs. And this westernization of the subject has in turn gendered and classed the westernization of the subject. So I think it's really remarkable, and hats off to Luis and Máximo for being so inclusive and so many women on the screen today. It's brilliant. It certainly wasn't like that when I started in 1993. So how we all move through this punishment and society field, I think, requires us to think anew about this idea of punishment. And I think Gavin's paper really captured some of that, looking at these puzzling trends in Kazakhstan. All of our punishment and society journeys remind us that the field of sociology of punishment globally is broad-ranging, and it's grounded in all sorts of theoretical inquiries. But what is so striking for me still is that the prison remains a deeply alluring category, a powerful social metaphor representing both society's lost trust and society's social failure, something that we also get, Gavin mentioned Nils Christie, he really reinforces this point about the need for validation. And so we cannot forget the fact that this is ultimately a deeply unbearable context, a prison. For me, this is all about how the regime becomes validated. And I mentioned Bourdieu here, the power to name things is the power to organise. The study that Gavin and I have designed is the culmination of ideas and discussions we've had over many years about trying to produce this empirical theoretical analysis of Russia's culture of punishment through an economic lens. And what do we mean by this? I'm referring here to the symbolic domination of culture and political ideology in penality, about understanding penality in the former Soviet Union as connecting sociologies of punishment, politics and economics, and crucially for us, culture, that operate like the boxes in Albert's painting across different time and place, but rooted in the construction and reconstruction of the prison's objects, relations and identities. Now, this comment that Hallquist is making, the political social body of the people as one, is what has, I think, alienated the countries from the former Soviet Union to some degree from global criminology. We know that Russia operated one of the largest and most grotesque penal systems of the 20th century. The multiple sociological processes that converged on captives and custodians are laid bare from the great memoirists from Solzhenitsyn to today to the very troubling case of Alexei Navalny. More than this, Russia and the countries of the former Soviet Union were able to produce a sustainable social order and social control coerced from above, and an incredible capacity to use environment and political power for mass societal oppression. So we see the Gulag is more than its acronym. It's more than a distinctive penal system. is an idealized image of a political social body. And what's happened here, there's been a sloppy kind of inertia in global criminology to understand how we connect this to trends in punitive attitudes. Because I say here, criminology has been, I think, gripped with exceptionalism. And these are the 4 reasons why I think the subject remains tricky when it comes to global carcerality. I've spent the last 27 years telling myself and being told that Russia is indeed exceptional. And it's hard to see why it's not exceptional when you look at the excessive way in which punishment was used. We've all reached for Milosi and Pavarini's A Prison in the Factory, and we've all, I'm sure, read Ruth Wilson Gilmore's Golden Gulag. Both are instructive texts for understanding how modernity shaped the birth of the prison using capital accumulation. The question is, this also to a degree happened in Russia, in the former Soviet Union. As Gavin said, it makes Russia not peripheral, but maybe semi-peripheral. But Russia remains in the former Soviet Union entirely othered in the canon of criminological work. And these are the reasons why. The dominance of transnational political ideology. As the decline of the Soviet Union gathered momentum in the late 1980s, complex questions emerged around what forms liberal democracy might take, the balance of power, how civil society is constructed and sustained. Addressing these questions took the form of seeking to westernize Russian prisons through, for example, the transnational human rights regimes of the Council of Europe. Dismantling this system required a vacuum of mechanisms having to come into place and be removed, an exchange through finance and trade, and innovation to try and establish what kind of Western society would Russia become, and therefore what kind of Western penal society would Russia become. I'd also like to say something here about linguistic colonialism. As mentioned, a Western prison theoretical sociological lens means that many great Russian works are not translated into English, and equally English language works are not translated into Russian. And that's really created a problem, and we see this in all areas of scholarship, not just the Russian language. Crucially, from an epistemological and ontological point of view, there is an obligation on Western scholars or overseas ethnographers to articulate, ground and deploy Western research methods. This has happened for decades. The social science Western research method scholarship has typically followed the trajectory of adaptation. One must first adopt Western approaches wholesale, then adapt them. And the discipline of prison sociology in the 1990s and even today remains primarily based on Westernized methods of data collection. And finally, Gavin alluded to the point of a preoccupation with the term. Gavin mentioned punitive leniency or punitivism. This focus on trends has actually come at a cost of looking at other levers, other more nuanced mechanisms that might be coming in to explain why a prison exists in the relationship in state and society relations. So I believe that there has been a kind of collective dysfunction within global criminology on what it chooses to compare when it comes to understanding penal development that has led to what Louise Brangen, who's here today, has called being put in the world music section of criminology conferences, which I think is a really eloquent way of saying that we're just all lumped together without a theoretical exploration. Now, there are other theoretical problems with looking at Russian prisons, and that concerns Russian area studies as well, and Gulag historians who become what Foucault has called the doctors of inexhaustible facts. In other words, the numbers game becomes heated and the heat missiles get fired at the stats. That has dominated the scholarship because archives, as we know, opened up in the 90s, and we were aware and became aware of the nature of scope and extent. So I think what this has done, and I'd be keen to hear other speakers from around the world, a kind of internal colonialism within the subject. Perhaps another way of considering exceptionalism, therefore, is not to ask what the role of the prison is in state-society relations, but for us, this is what I'm interested in Gulag Shadow, and I know I'll speak for Gavin too and Dan, not to ask what is Russia in the penal cultural space, but kind of what does Russia become through understanding the penal cultural space? How does it make sense? How do we make sense of the culture that gives birth to the prison rather than looking just at institutional forms? And so my point here is, I would like to understand what makes Russia non-exceptional. We know that prisons in the Soviet Union, prisoners had to live in a kind of brutalized regime context as a matter of public policy, and that the prison transcended its physical details. My question, therefore, is if this accumulation strategy mimicked some of the penal philosophical developments of so-called Western penal development. In other words, to paraphrase Marx, prisoners like those in Western prisons, in the development of the prison, did become the personification of economic categories and were brought into the ideology of the state. And so I think the question is, why might we consider prisoner agency and structure in this context? We understand the prisoner existed within what Garland called existing social and cultural relations. We know that prisons and prisoners operate in distinctive spaces of experience, constituted of custom and tradition, and yet, despite this semi-peripheral status, or indeed elements of a shared modernity, Russia and the former Soviet Union is still framed as a culturally distinctive nation. As I am conscious of time, so just to sort of push the debate forward, and I really would like this debate because I've been prevented from doing so up until now, so thanks again to the organisers. Gavin referred to decarceration in his slides, and so did José. We know that in recent years there's been a between 30 and 40% drop in prison population rates in Russia and Kazakhstan. We're trying to get to the bottom of why this is happening by explaining the politicisation of punishment in different ways in Russia and Kazakhstan and how people feel about the prison in society. What Gavin didn't have time to mention is that he and I, namely him, have interviewed penal elites to try and make sense of these trends in Russia and Kazakhstan. We know that Russia embraced human rights reform, with a kind of rapacious speed that would actually blow your mind in the 1990s. There was a veritable avalanche of reforms under Boris Yeltsin from 1991 until 1999, when the second wave of Putinism started. We also know that Russia has presidential councils that are engaged with human rights. And so there's an interesting thing here about co-opting human rights narratives from organisations and NGOs who want to design human rights into policy. If you look at the scene, the Russian Prison Services website, the brand is very much written in the European way of showing that Russia engages with human rights concerns. At the same time, we have the thriving polyopticon that Gavin and I have written about, the many viewing the many. Russia's penal architecture is a fascinating example of the Soviet microcosm. You live, you work. That's still there today and remains resilient. I put up a cartoon here. It says Для жалоб. It's a complaint being thrown down the toilet. The joke being, there's no point in complaining about the Russian prison system because it gets you nowhere. That echoes Calavita and Jennings' work about prisons being lawless agencies as well. And we know that Russia, concerningly so, has an extremely weak civil society right now that isn't able to push against what we call the penal authoritarianism of the Putin regime. So just to conclude my talk, when I talk about penal porosity, what I'm explaining here is this idea of cultural norms and political ideological frameworks seeping into the penal infrastructure and creating a sense of kind of ideological and cultural practice that Gavin referred to with the ongoing debate about the prison officer context in Russia. And there's some noises about the Russian prison officer context wanting to change back to the Ministry of the Interior rather than the Ministry of Justice. Ashley Rubin explains penal reforms, however innovative, rarely emerge fully formed. And I think that is one of the reasons why we still see Russia as exceptional. Political scientists argue that Russia does not cohere around a binary of exceptionalism and commonality or of particularism and compatibility. This is, they argue, too simplistic. And I think we concur with the political science thesis that Russia does not follow the approach of a clash of civilizations or a struggle between ideologies as the hallmark of Russia's positionality in the world. We believe that, or I believe that, this traps efforts to fully understand Russia's political and cultural system as hybrid or a quasi-authoritarianism. Hence, if we were to take prisons as a case study in human rights, is it the case but when a prison system violates international norms, that it becomes exceptional. It seems to be that that's how Russia has been framed in socio-legal discourse. Penal authoritarianism is an important point to sort of revisit. Civil society means acutely weak in Russia. We know that democratic citizenship gives promise of creating a support base, for democratic leaders. Civil society goes hand in hand with a free enterprise market economy of different political parties because significantly it prevents the state from drifting towards authoritarianism. And that's something we're looking at through our surveys. We know that this is under perpetual threat in Russia, and the penal system from previous projects I've worked on and in the Gulag shadow contains residues of the past and firmly locates these residues in a version of the legacy of the past, the penal authoritarianism. We know, as Shetsyova has argued, that the brand of authoritarianism under Vladimir Putin seeks less to boost his brand in penal and personal authority, and increasingly to brand the power of bureaucratic groups and institutions to act in his name. So just to conclude, as Tony Wood has said in his brilliant book on Putinism, the political culture approach, that's Jackman and Miller, the political culture approach needs to be recast in institutional terms. What I mean by this is that the study of Russia's institutional culture, in this case, its penal culture, necessitates, I believe, a different approach beyond exceptionality that moves the analysis away from these binary positions of leniency, punitivism, exceptionalism, similarity, homogeneity, because what they do is they kind of create triggers that alienate and keep subjects and countries in the periphery. We know that cultural norms are relational, passed down through generations, and shaped by and themselves shape economic and political performance. Norms then become subject to fluctuations in terms of resistance and non-resistance to change. So finally, I'd like to say, cultural values and their links to political performance have therefore become highly contested among political scientists who argue that political change alters the opportunities available to institutional actors in this space, all of the actors involved in the penal system. And I'll leave it at that with just a reference to some of the books and articles that we're reading in the project and a link to the Gulag Shadow study. I've also sent everybody a link to a film that's being screened tonight from our project too. It's a shameless plug. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Laura. Thank you very much, all of you, for these great papers. So we have now as our discussant, René from Swaaningen. René, you have some minutes to make your comments or questions. Then I will give the opportunity to the presenters to address your comments and questions for 2 or 3 minutes each of them, and then we will open the floor to other questions from the attendants. Thank you, René.
Thank you, Máximo, and also thank you for the invitation to reflect on these very interesting papers that, well, made a lot of sense to me and also gave me a lot of food for thought. I hope I can read my own scribble and make sense of it, but I'll do my best. Let me first come back to your introduction, Máximo, also because Laura has picked up on several of these issues of the very word of periphery, exceptionalism. I mean, all these words are very loaded words which presuppose that there would be a center, right? And this is, of course, the difficulty. If you have a periphery, you also have a center. Well, what is this center? It's maybe the whole word periphery is a bit of an Anglo-American colonialism over our scientific field. And it is true, as Laura was arguing, that still non-English languages are invisible in the international debate, and that is not only problematic because we also do very interesting stuff, but because we miss a lot of knowledge about how the world runs. So the Anglo-American colonialism is relatively recent, I would say. I mean, it's past World War II. Before that is where we wrote in French, right? And before that we wrote in Latin. And probably in 20 years or 25 years, we will write in Chinese. So it's temporary, this Anglo-American era, I would say, right? And it's also a matter of scale. I mean, I come from the Netherlands, and Dutch criminologists tend to think that the Netherlands is the center of the universe. And as Europeans, we probably speak more about Brussels or Strasbourg than about London or Washington. I mean, it's a matter of perspective also. And yeah, in this sense, most of the world is periphery, and most of the knowledge remains of the knowledge of the world remains unknown in the international debate. So I pick up on Laura's, and supportively pick up on Laura's criticism of the very idea of exceptionalism, because it presupposes a normality. I criticize the idea of periphery because it presupposes a center. So these are some preliminary remarks, but they're picked up in many of the papers. I start with Branda's paper now. The decreased prison population in the global north is indeed very often seen as a kind of Elysian moment. As you may know, I don't agree with that, because I think we live in a punitive. It's more the increase of the punitive city, as Stanley Cohen has called it. So our punitiveness has not changed that much, but the means by which we achieve punitiveness has changed in many Western industrialized ex-welfare state interventionist states. I think that is the key thing that has changed from prison to community sanctions. They are equally punitive very often. The reasons for the increased crime rates, we all know it's a contested relation. I think the example you gave of homicide rates is the more convincing, and you see it in a lot of studies, that the severe violence is has the largest predictive value. I mean, of course, Tapio Lapisepala is the main expert on this, who made all these correlations, and I think it works for most of the countries. So I think you're on the right track here as well. Crime concern is known to be more predictive than crime per se, right? So, and this also corresponds with what you're saying. On migration control and moral panics, I mean, in many Western countries, that has been the motor behind an increased incarceration. So the absence of that in Latin America is probably something that needs to be explained. Why, despite the fact that there is not this migration control or this necessity of building walls and all and what have you, that nevertheless, whereas it has been a motor for an increased punitiveness in many European countries, the increased punitiveness in Latin America has increased without all these context variables that played such a key role in the European development. So again, it would be an argument for an independent track, not comparing it with West European studies, because they fall short on certain points, right? Also, the authoritarian tradition that has been taken up by Gavin and by Laura is something that we take as an exceptionalism, but probably on a world scale it isn't, right? Trafficking drugs, of course, consumption, but in many countries in the Western world, drug consumption, particularly in the Netherlands, has never been a major motor of incarceration, right? But I would say that the crisis on the war on drugs is as yet still a motive to increase it, particularly when it comes to drug trafficking, and particularly when it comes to the production of crystal meth, for example, which is now a massive problem in the Netherlands, that the Mexican cooks are coming massively to the Netherlands to produce the crystal meth here. So I would not say that the crisis on the war of drugs leads to any less punitiveness, I would say. On the reverse, I would say. Not on the consumption part, but on the production and the trafficking part, yes. Moving over to Gavin. The Kazakhstan decarceration, interesting. I mean, you're right. If you hear something about the former Soviet Union, you hear things about Russia, not so much about Kazakhstan. I would not agree, though, that there's not a lot of literature on decarceration. There is, of course. Maybe not the more empirical literature. There's much more empirical literature on the increase of punishment, but there is a whole tradition on decarceration studies, starting with Andrew Scull's work on decarceration from the 70s on, all to the abolitionist, penal abolitionist tradition, to let's say, as an alternative model for penal policy. The weak spot, of course, was that it was not backed up with concrete examples. Although, and then I come with my own country, the Netherlands has in the 70s came quite close to very, very low imprisonment rates. At a certain point, we had 18 prisoners per 100,000, right? So this is extremely low. Yeah. I would want to say that looking at your figures, the situation in the Soviet Union and their whole sphere of influence have always had a very high imprisonment rate. And if I look at your figures, I would call them high if you compare them with EU rates, and indeed also with many Asian rates. So they're still high. Let's take that also in consideration when we speak about decarceration. Most of my questions are what I would call why questions, right? You say Kazakhstan looks like a very active reductionist policy. The question is why, and I didn't really get my hands behind it. Prison is very expensive and it's little effective. Sure, that's true. It goes for all over the world. When California reached nearly its bankruptcy, they also said, well, all these guys that we have locked up in California are not that dangerous after all. And then they set them free. So that is a mechanism that goes in many places of the world as a main driver of decarceration, is simply prisons are very expensive and very little effective when it comes to influencing crime rates. But it doesn't seem to be enough. Wanting to become a normal country. Sure. Why would they want that? Right? Authoritarian, and you give part of the answer yourself. Many authoritarian regimes couldn't care less what others think of them, right? And I cannot see why they would. You say yourself, public opinion doesn't matter that much, but why would the opinion of the rest of the world matter to them? Why? That is something that you could say. The same goes for the simulated efficacy. Why would they want to simulate efficacy? If I was an authoritarian leader, then I would say I'm the boss and you listen, right? I mean, so this is mostly my questions. Your explanations seem very plausible, but why would they want it is still an unanswered question for me. Prison staff, you mentioned it, or everybody working in the penal system. In the countries I've studied, they mostly had a mitigating effect on harsh policy. If policy was hard, they say, well, we're confronted on a day-to-day basis with these poor sods, and we know many of them couldn't help getting here, or they could help ending up here, but okay, let's not make it worse for them. So you see very lenient opinions on punitiveness in prison staff in Western countries. And I wondered, you touched upon it, how that would be in a country like Kazakhstan. The same goes for the human rights discourse. Human rights discourse in countries where it is valued has also a mitigating effect on imprisonment rates. In countries, though, where human rights is seen as something for wetties, for softies, it doesn't, right? I mean, there needs to be a human rights consciousness in order to play a role. And I wondered also, to what extent would you see a human rights discourse that is shared, even shared amongst the elites? To what extent is that the case? And to Laura, on the background, Laura's paper was present all the time, because I share many of your comments. I don't know if you've seen it, but in a recent article in the Oxford Encyclopedia of International Criminology, I did a chapter on cultural bias, which comes very close to your argument. So that the reproduction of dominant relations, if you study non-Western countries from a Western lens, is indeed a major problem for international criminology and international penology. I cannot underline that enough. The challenge is, though, I think, and it's difficult questions, and I don't have an answer, but maybe you have, is how would a more situated knowledge lead to different conclusions and different analysis and different paradigms and different lenses? And what consequences would it have for the way we study these other realities? Looking at the working of institutions, where you touch upon, might be a good way forward, because in the working, the day-to-day practices of our institutions, you do see a lot of differences. And so thank you all for your inspiring contributions. I think I remained within my 10 minutes, or didn't I? More or less. Okay, I'll leave it here. And again, cheers for 3 excellent papers and a good introduction.